If you just finished watching the video on the premise in an argument, you'll recall that the reason indicator, words like since or for or because, can help us identify the reason of the argument, but they also help us find the conclusion. So in this case, we have since, we fight all the time. The blue part, that's going to be a premise or something we assume to be true for the argument. And then what comes after the premise, that's the conclusion. It's best if we don't see each other. Or in this case, we have because. What follows the because is prices are very low. That's a premise or a fact. Therefore, we should buy a home. The part that came before the because, that's our conclusion. If the passage is being nice to you, and they will be nice about half the time, the passage will give you conclusion indicators to help you identify the conclusion. Words like so, therefore, thus, and hence. What comes immediately after these words is often the conclusion. In this case, we have the same argument we saw before, but instead of a reason indicator like because or since, we now have a conclusion indicator, the so. What comes after the so, that's our conclusion. What came before the so, that's our fact or our premise. When you're trying to identify the conclusion in an argument, contrast words can be a clue. Words like but, yet, however, and still. These words indicate that the point of the argument or passage is very different than the sentences that came right before the contrast word. So, if you meet with your boss and she says, look, you're very qualified and I wanted to give you the promotion, but as soon as she says but, you know you're not getting the promotion. So we said conclusion indicators, words like so, thus, and therefore, and contrast words, words like but and yet, however. Those can be clues to help you find the conclusion, but oftentimes they're not enough by themselves. But here is a golden rule. Your conclusion is always an opinion. And oftentimes you have key words that indicate that part of the argument is the opinion. So anytime the argument talks about what's right or wrong, using words like what we should do or ought to do or need to do, or when the argument makes a prediction about what will happen, or if the argument interprets data with phrases like this means that, or shows that, or proves, those are all opinions, and your conclusion is always the strongest opinion in the argument. If you know about opinion indicators, then identifying the conclusion is often very easy. Like in this case, we have a fairly long passage, but the word should is in the first sentence. That's the strongest opinion. Should is the strongest opinion word you will ever see. The first sentence then, that's our conclusion. What comes after the conclusion, that's our reason or our premise. Here's a passage we saw in the premise video, and we pointed out how we had something we thought was an opinion, this part where it says novels are indifferent to important moral questions. That looked like an opinion, but it was preceded by many critics complain that. And remember, when you're quoting somebody else's opinion, that's considered a fact. What comes after the fact in this case is this charge is unfair. And this word unfair is a judgment about whether something is good or bad or right or wrong. That's your strongest opinion. So the conclusion in this case is the charge is unfair, or that this blue part here is wrong. Oftentimes arguments will have multiple clues about what is the conclusion, such as in this case. First, we have this great contrast word, however. That suggests what comes after the however could be the conclusion. We also have this word for. That's a reason indicator. And since the reason indicator came in the middle of the sentence, the conclusion likely came before it. Lastly, we have this great word, justify. And that's a judgment about what's right or wrong or good or bad. So we can be fairly confident that this purported fact does not justify the government silencing the groups. That's our conclusion.